if you rely primarily on television news networks for your information, it's quite likely you're oblivious to what's been happening on and around the Indo-China border, the LAC. India, remember, shares a more than 3,400-kilometer border with China. June 15, 2020 saw the first deadly clash since 1975 along the line of actual control when 20 Indian soldiers and at least four soldiers of the Chinese People's Liberation Army were killed. 16 rounds of talks between military commanders of India and China since have, by all accounts, failed to force China's hand in returning to a pre Galwan territorial status quo. Meanwhile, China has been fortifying their existing construction and building new construction on encroached Indian land. Just last week, The Telegraph quoted a source in the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, which guards the border with China, as saying that Beijing is fortifying its position inside Indian territory it has occupied since 2020 by erecting watchtowers mounted with CCTVs at the Depsang Plains and hot springs in Ladakh. These areas are 18 kilometers inside Indian lines. The Telegraph reports that China is estimated to have taken over close to 1,000 square kilometers of India-claimed territory in eastern Ladakh since May 2020. Furthermore, last month, the South Morning China Post reported that China will be undertaking construction of a second highway through the disputed Aksai Chin region. In July, for weeks, Chinese aircraft flew near to the line of actual control, violating the agreed upon CBM of not entering into a 10-kilometer radius along the LAC. The intent behind these violations is reportedly to determine India's response time and test the Indian defense system in the region. So, how has India responded to all of this? You would recall that the Modi government, in the days following the June 2020 clashes, denied that China had entered or occupied any Indian territory. The official communication on Chinese adventurism since has arguably lacked transparency. How can India's policy be characterized militarily and diplomatically? Let's ask Sushant Singh, defense analyst and senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research. Mr. Singh, thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us here at Scroll.
Thank you so much, Smita. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Mr. Singh, to start off, on the basis of your interactions with the Indian military or sources in the defense establishment, what information can you independently attest to on the scale of Chinese encroachment and the occupation of Indian territory since 2020?
So occupation may be an incorrect word to understand what's going on. So as you rightly said, that the line of actual control in Ladakh, where the crisis is there, has not been demarcated between the two sides. But there are areas over which both sides exercise control in some manner. Now, control can be exercised in various manners. It can be exercised by being physically deploying your troops there. It can be exercised by patrolling those areas. It can be exercised by flying your UAVs over those places and taking images. So it can be through various means. So Indian patrols used to exercise their control up to a certain limit before the crisis began in 2020. And what has happened since 2020 is that Indian patrols are unable to exercise that control by patrolling up to these areas, either because they've been denied by Chinese troops who have blocked Indian patrols' paths, or because of some of the disengagement agreements that have been signed with China since. That is essentially the point, that Indian control over certain territory in Ladakh, which used to exist, does not exist anymore.
Okay, so does this have any implication for territorial integrity of India as we see it along the line of control? And the other question is, what sort of defense or security implications does, for example, these fortifications in these areas have?
Yes, of course, it is about territorial integrity. It is about sovereignty. It is about both the primary functions that any government, any state primarily safeguards and guards. That's what essentially modern states do since the Westphalian states came into picture. You know, you safeguard your territorial integrity and you safeguard your sovereignty. That you should be able to exercise decisions based on your own judgment. I think in this case in Ladakh, we have been unable to exercise our rights to safeguard our territorial integrity in some manner, as well as exercise our sovereignty by asserting our claim over the areas that we have claim over. As for what is the quantum of area that India has lost control over, If you remember, Vijeta Singh of the Hindu, one of the reporters who has been actively reporting on the crisis, mentioned it as more than 1,000 square kilometers. And I think that's a very fair estimate considering the kind of area that has been denied in Depsang, particularly. Then, if you include Galwan, then if you include Pangong, you include Kailash Range, and you include Demchok, 1,000 square kilometers seems to be a conservative estimate. It may only be more than that.
All right. Mr. Singh, government sympathizers, when faced with the question of the Modi administration's failure to, hold China to account, if I may, or to restore status quo, point to what they say has been this gradual and relentless sort of encroachment from China over the last many decades. In fact, even when asked about the construction and fortification undertaken by China recently, the foreign ministry said that the activity was happening in areas under illegal occupation of China for around 60 years. That is to say, that not the territory encroached on since May 2020. My question is, how are post Galwan developments different from what may have been sort of incremental Chinese incursions earlier?
So essentially, what the government spoke about is the fact that India lost a war in 1962, and certain amount of territory was lost to China, or control of certain amount of territory. The Chinese continue to be in occupation of that territory, and the recent bridge in Pangong, about which the foreign ministry spokesperson statement was, mentioned that. But that, to my mind, is a political statement. The fundamental point which we are talking about is that in the last 2 years, in the last 27 months, the areas which India was exercising control over, India has ceded control, lost control over those areas. That is the fundamental point that has happened. Was it gradual? Has it happened over decades? No, that's not true. The point is that a lot of this crisis has only begins in the last 12 to 13 years. And the genesis of that crisis lies in the fact that, if you remember, the UPA government under Dr. Manmohan Singh, Shyam Saran, the former foreign secretary, headed a committee on India-China border infrastructure, which decided that India needed to develop its infrastructure. This was in early 2005, 2006. And India-China border roads plan was made, and a lot of infrastructure plans were made. By 2008-9, when the global economic crisis began and China started asserting itself in the South China Sea, the government of India decided that this is something which China would do on the India border as well. And it is then that two new army divisions were raised in the northeast, and the plans for a strike corps were also finalized. It is around that time, 2010, 11, 12, that you start seeing more clashes happening between Indian and Chinese patrol. And that is because, starting with 2008-9, more Indian troops are available on the China border. They are available to go to these areas where they wanted to go earlier, more frequently, in greater numbers, and then they start clashing with Chinese troops, Chinese patrols, who start asserting that you were not coming here earlier. Why are you coming here now? If you remember, in 2013, a major two-week-long crisis over Depsang happened, where the Chinese had blocked the Indian patrols, and there was a quid pro quo. Indians did something in Chumar, and then the area was vacated after 2 weeks. This is the same area where the crisis now continues for more than 27 months in Depsang. Similarly, when Mr. Modi was welcoming President Xi Jinping in 2014, and they were sitting on a swing in Ahmedabad, if you remember, the Chinese troops had come into Chumar. And that crisis, and the troops continued to stay even when Xi Jinping was in Ahmedabad and in Delhi. And that crisis was resolved, I think, after 3 or 4 weeks. So a lot of these crises have happened since the time India decided that it needed to be more assertive on the China border. And over the last 15, 17 years, particularly over the last 12, 13 years, number of clashes have increased, number of such incidents on the border have increased. Of course, the most famous being on the other side, on the eastern side, where in Doklam in 2017, Indian troops went into Bhutanese territory and stopped Chinese from constructing a road. The Chinese, of course, went apocalyptic, and then they have come back and created these areas where they have built infrastructure, deployed their troops again. But the fact is that these clashes, these kind of incidents have been happening over a period of time. But what makes Ladakh since 2020 different is the fact that the Chinese continue to be in occupation of that areas over the last 27 months. India, almost internally, domestically, is not saying that Chinese are controlling the areas or denying us control of areas which we were controlling earlier. This is also the fact that India is not doing anything proactive to restore the status quo ante. Talks have really not worked, as you rightly said. 16 rounds of core commander talks, n number of lower level commander talks, thousands of telephone calls, 10 rounds of WMCC diplomatic level talks. Foreign ministers have met so many times. Defense minister met his counterpart, Chinese counterpart, once in Moscow. All this has happened, but there's been no way, there's been no a great plan to restore the status quo, restore the status quo ante, so to speak, which existed before April 2020. Now we have reached a situation where the kind of infrastructure that the Chinese have built up, the kind of deployment that the Chinese have done. You spoke about the increased capacity of their air bases, increased capacity to deploy troops, to house troops, that they have actually altered the status quo. There is no status quo ante as of April 2020 to be restored anymore. So this becomes a fait accompli. That is the big issue. That's the big difference which has happened in 2020. That whatever has happened in Ladakh over the whole almost the whole LAC in Ladakh has become a fait accompli for India, and India refuses to even domestically acknowledge that such a major crisis continues to remain on the borders. And I'm not even talking about the fact that India lost 20 of its troops. Nearly 50 to 60,000 troops continue to remain deployed there. And, this is a very significant situation. But we find, as you rightly said, hardly any coverage other than few publications or few reports in digital platforms. This is very surprising, and it seems to have almost emboldened the Chinese in a manner that they have altered the status quo and they have made it a fait accompli on India.
You've already sort of answered this question. Even so, I want to, if you can characterize the Modi government's China policy, not just the response to what has happened to the border, including the, as you said, 16 rounds of military level talks, etc. The overall China policy. Now, I'm asking you one particular example that comes to mind and was recently pointed out by Suhasini Haider, the foreign affairs editor of The Hindu. Some of the positions adopted post Galwan by this government seem not to be applied consistently. And this is what she pointed out. Recently, we saw China's Afghan envoy in Delhi for talks. And the point being made here is that the government's earlier reported position was that there would be no other talks until the boundary standoff was resolved. And evidently that position was junked.
Yeah, that's true. What Suhasini says is absolutely right. Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar is on record, if I remember correctly, in May or June, when Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in India, saying that there can be no normalcy in ties between India and China till the time border situation is not stabilized, or there is not peace and tranquility on the border, the formal term that India uses. But the fact of the matter is that everything is normal between India and China. Trade, as you know, India is China's biggest. China is India's biggest trade partner, or nearly the biggest trade partner over the last so many years. We had a record amount of trade, more than $100 billion last year. The trade imbalance between India and China is very high. And remember, China is not Saudi Arabia or Iran, from which we import crude without which we cannot do. We don't import coal or crude or any of the raw materials from China. What we import from China is high-end goods, finished products, and this should surprise us. So there's the fact that we are willing to talk with China on every single issue, including Afghanistan. The fact that trade ties remain absolutely perfect, and the trade is increasing by every day, with the trade imbalance being unfavorable to trade balance being unfavorable to us. The fact that multilateral banks which are stationed in China continue to give India loans. You'll be surprised that the AIIB, which is based out of Beijing, gave a quarter of its loans to India. The Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank gave quarter of its loans to India. So how is it that this stated policy that there can be no normalcy in ties clearly does not seem to apply to China, as I see it? If I were a Chinese, I would be very happy if Indians kept on saying, "Oh, there will be no normalcy in ties, and we'll not treat you normally." But you continue to have trade with me. You continue to welcome my diplomats here. You continue to take multilateral infrastructure investments, and you even continue to actually have some investments in fintech firms and in other private companies. Although in recent months, some of the Chinese telecom companies, some of the Chinese mobile manufacturing firms, they have been targeted. But I think that's more for domestic consumption than really affecting China. I don't think China gets affected because you do an ED raid on Vivo or on Xiaomi. I think that's more for domestic consumption, that we have banned whatever 60 apps, Chinese apps, and 50 Chinese apps. So TikTok may have gone, but I really don't think that really causes any pain to China or to the Chinese state or to the Chinese PLA to start saying, oh, you have banned TikTok and 60 apps, now let me vacate Depsang or Demchok or Hot Spring. This is something which is fundamentally, you are saying something else and you are doing something else. And the second thing which I would like to point out in this is that when this crisis started, or first few months after the crisis, the Indian line is that we want a restoration of the status quo ante as of before the crisis began. That is early 2020, before May 2020. But no longer does the government utter this word. And because you mentioned Suhasini posed this question to Mr. Jaishankar in a press conference, and Mr. Jaishankar evaded answering that question. She point blank asked, is India, or did India insist with Mr. Wang Yi that we are going to restore status quo ante, and that was clearly missing from there. Prime Minister attended the BRICS summit, with which President Xi Jinping presided over, even though virtually. For the SCO foreign ministers meeting, Mr. Jaishankar was again there. There's a likelihood that the Prime Minister will attend the SCO summit physically in China, which will be where President Xi Jinping will be present. So while the Chinese refuse to even talk about the areas they have control over, refuse to vacate those areas, the crisis continues to remain. India seems to be treating as if things are perfectly normal, while announcing that, oh, things cannot be normal with China, unless the crisis is resolved in some manner. So there is large amount of inconsistency, contradictions, and almost at one level deception in what the policy is. And the deception is being played not on the Chinese, but is being played on the Indian population, on the Indian citizenry.
Right. And that then leads me to the question on India's options. And Mr. Singh, bear with me, this is a bit of a long question. There have been differing views on what should drive India's strategic calculus. Some of these decisions, vis-a-vis committing fully to the Quad in particular, to manage a belligerent China. And some, like Happymon Jacob, Associate Professor of Diplomacy and Disarmament at the JNU, this is what he said. He had tweeted to say, is Indo-Pacific / Quad an answer to PLA's LAC aggression? And the hypothesis is, if India has significant naval assets in the Indo-Pacific and it coordinates with friendly navies, including the Quad, it could put psychological pressure on China and make it think twice before undertaking any LAC ops. Then, Mr. Singh, there are also others who point out that, look, there's a sea between China and the other countries of the Quad, whereas India has a long land border with the country, and that sort of forecloses some options for us, and that our calculations should ensure that we don't provoke China. Yet others say that the Prime Minister has, in fact, in recent times acted in enlightened self-interest. This is a term that I've seen sort of bandied about, and that he has stayed the course on multipolarity.
But as far as dealing with China is concerned, the strategy initially, what it seemed like was that it was a two-pronged strategy. There would be some amount of internal rebalancing on the borders, and there would be some amount of external rebalancing. And let me explain it a bit. Internal rebalancing meant that certain amount of troops and forces and assets, military assets, which were available which were kept earmarked for the Pakistan border, would be transferred or shifted, or their attention would be diverted towards the China border. And this was done in significant number. I think 6 divisions of the Indian Army, including a strike corps, have been told to shift their focus from Pakistan to the China border, and they have done that. So this included deployment of large number of troops, including a Rashtriya Rifles force, which was moved from Udhampur region to the Kailash range region. So significant amount of internal rebalancing of forces. And now the question about how does it leave us vis-a-vis Pakistan is a second order question, which I'm not going into here. But the fact is that some amount of internal rebalancing had taken place over the last 2 years. The question about Quad is about external rebalancing. That is, can you find some kind of mechanism by which you work with your partners, with your friends, we don't have allies, but with your friends and partners, to somehow create a kind of pressure on China, so that China is unable to do what it wants to do on the land borders. But as we have seen, India's position has been, as you rightly said, to not provoke China in any way. And I'll give you 3 specific cases in this, even while the crisis has been on. One is Xinjiang. In Xinjiang, India does not issue any statement whatsoever, despite the Chinese doing what they have done in Xinjiang. which is very surprising. And whatever the Chinese have done with Uyghurs in Xinjiang, India does not issue a statement at all.
Right.
On Hong Kong, what China did over the last couple of years in Hong Kong, and now, of course, it has completely been done the way it has been done. While the Western countries, etc., were issuing a lot of strong statements, India never issued a strong statement on Hong Kong and the Chinese behavior in Hong Kong. And now, during the Taiwan crisis, India did not issue a single statement on the Taiwan crisis. India was completely silent. So, if the idea was to work with your partners and allies and friends and find ways in which to put pressure on China, that has clearly not been done by India to the extent that it should have been done. And I think the fear which we see in the manner in which Prime Minister Modi said on 19 June that nobody has entered our territory and nobody is in control of our territory, etc., etc. It clearly points to the kind of fear of provoking China into doing something more. So somehow the policy, as it seems right now, is can we hold the line? Whatever we have lost, maybe may have been lost, but can I hold the line and keep it here, and then go from here on and see what I can do, or what I can do more. And I think that is what is happening more and more. That I should not lose any more territory. I'll deploy my troops through my internal rebalancing. In an external rebalancing, I'll try to do something, but I'll not do it enough so as not to provoke China. And I think that's a kind of a weakness which we are seeing in the way the external rebalancing bit is being done. Also, the external rebalancing bit is not that easy. Do we really expect that the Americans or the Japanese or the Australians will come and defend our land borders? I doubt. Do we defend that they will? Do we really wonder that they would send their naval assets and start pressurizing China wherever in South China Sea or in the Pacific so that it takes away the pressure of India? I doubt. At best, the kind of cooperation that you can expect from the United States is what it did during Ladakh. That is, provide you intelligence support, provide you some amount of logistics support, and provide you some other kind of information and some other kind of diplomatic support. But really, the fact of the matter is that on the continental borders, on the borders in Ladakh or Arunachal or Himachal or Uttarakhand or Sikkim, Indian soldiers, Indian military, Indian armed forces, Indian Air Force, Indian Navy, Indian Army will have to fight the PLA on their own. The Indian state, with its diplomatic capacities, with its economic capacities, with its military capacities, with its informational capacities, will have to deal with China on its own. Others can come in support, but that support will be very minimal and it cannot make up for the deficiencies that India has. And that primarily the basic deficiency that India has is that the gap between Indian power and the Chinese power has increased over the last decade. The Chinese economy is now 5.5 times India's size. The Chinese defense spending is nearly 4 times India's defense spending. Chinese technological power is at a different level. To give you an example, China has a space station, manned space station. India is still a long way off from having a manned space station. The kind of technological progress that the Chinese are able to demonstrate is of a different level. This increasing gap in power is what is really putting under pressure. Indian economy has not done well over the last few years. And because Indian economy has not done well since demonetization, it is unable to provide the kind of resources that Indian armed forces need to build themselves up. So you have a scenario where instead of 42 squadrons of Indian Air Force fighter jets, the Indian Air Force has only 30 squadrons or 31 squadrons. This shortfall is not being made. This shortfall is only increasing. The Navy, which you spoke of, that what can it do in the Indo-Pacific along with other partner navies of the Quad? The Navy wants to be a 200-ship Navy. It is now a 130-ship Navy. It wants 3 aircraft carrier. China has just started testing its 3rd aircraft carrier. India has 2 aircraft. India's 2nd aircraft carrier is under construction, under testing. The only aircraft carrier India has in service, INS Vikramaditya, which came from Russia, has been in maintenance since early 2021. During the whole of the crisis, it has not been available. If India is going to project power in the seas along with its partners and give confidence to its partners, Quad partners, how is it going to do it? We have seen the crisis over Agnipath, over which we spoke a few weeks back. That's essentially to do about money. We are dealing with a situation where the government, the Indian government, the current Indian government, finds it difficult to provide the financial resources or the muscle that are needed to take on an adversary like China. The increasing power gap between India and China makes it very difficult for us to deal with the situation. And that is why our response to China our political response to China, or response of our political leadership to the Chinese threat or to the Chinese challenge, has been so muted, because this government will find it extremely difficult to say that over the last 8 years, the gap with China has only increased under our watch, and we have been unable to find ways to deal with it, and the economy is unable to sustain the kind of resources that are needed to deal with the Chinese threat.
A couple of quick final questions. I don't know, you spoke about this sort of reorientation on the border of forces from the Pakistan border to the Chinese border, and I thought you used the word significant reorientation. Is that correct? You
Yeah,
said.
that's true. Yeah, there's a it, yeah,
What are the
there's a
risks it entails, Mr. Singh? Is it possible for you to sort of reflect on what sort of a situation we're looking at here? What is the risk that we're looking at? The significant reorientation of troops towards the sort of and sort of an added to that question is the failure to restart this sort of political process in Jammu and Kashmir since the abrogation of Article 370. Would you say that has to an extent sort of contributed to the sort of security risks that remain on that side of the border?
So, as you remember, Smitha, the Indian military planners and Indian military leaders were very fond of talking about a two-front or a two-and-a-half-front war. And the whole conversation over the last 2 years or so, when the crisis with China has been there, that those words have almost gone missing from the conversation of our military leaders or retired military veterans, who would go and talk about, oh, India has a two-front threat, etc., and needs to deal with it. So, the point that I'm trying to make here is that India had certain amount of resources which it had allocated to deal with the Pakistani threat. Let's say if anything happens with Pakistan, this is what we would do. Now now those resources have been reoriented towards China. So if a situation develops with Pakistan, India would find, while the China crisis is on, it would be very difficult for India to execute the kind of plans it had earlier. And what I'm referring to is, remember the 2019 pre-election Balakot airstrike, where the tensions were very high. The two sides were about to fight missiles on each other. Now, in the last 2 years or so, Mr. Modi or his political party is not attacking Pakistan anymore. Nobody is telling Smita Nair or Supriya Sharma or Sushant Singh to go to Pakistan. Essentially, Pakistan is not even figuring in any of the conversations in political rallies, in election campaigns. Whereas if you remember 2017 Gujarat campaign, 2017 UP campaign, 2019 Lok Sabha election campaign, everything was directed against Pakistan. Pakistan was the big issue. And that is primarily because you cannot afford to have a crisis with Pakistan. It is for that reason, in August 2020, India started serious back-channel negotiations with Pakistan, because India was worried that if Pakistan were to somehow start mobilizing on the line of control in Kashmir against India, while the border crisis in Ladakh was on, India would find it very, very difficult to deal with that situation. And that is why those talks were on. And as the Express Tribune, the Pakistani newspaper, reported yesterday, those talks have been going on and the lines of communication have been open even now. But in April 2022, in April this year, the talks were at their peak. But as you know, the Pakistani side insists that something should be done on Kashmir before anything can happen. Whereas the Indian side is saying, no, we are not going to do anything on Kashmir. You can start bilateral trade before that. And I think that is where the talks have got stuck. And so the fact that Indian domestic politics of Mr. Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party no longer targets Pakistan is directly a function of what we have seen on the China border. Has Kashmir contributed to the threat? Yes, Kashmir remains a volatile area, despite nearly 3 years have passed, more than 3 years have passed since the abrogation of Article 370. We were promised that Pakistan's claim over Kashmir will go away. There will be no militancy left in Kashmir. There would be like huge amount of development, economic development in Kashmir. Industrialization will be at the top. Nothing of that sort has happened. What we have actually seen is Kashmiri Pandits protesting and asking to be moved out. Threats have only increased. The kind of militancy it has evolved into is a totally different kind of militancy, because the solution to the Kashmir problem or the challenges that it poses is not a security solution. It is a political solution, but we do not see that political will on display to actually find a political answer to the problems of the Kashmiris, or to give expression to their political rights. There is no talk about elections. There is no talk about statehood. There is no engagement with the Kashmiri political leadership. Security forces or a very hardline very strong stand cannot be an answer. And the fact of the matter is that the 2019 decision to bifurcate Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh as separate union territories and to abrogate Article 370 did contribute in some measure to the crisis that we have seen on the China border, because China constantly kept on protesting about that decision, and some of the infrastructure construction, as we have seen from satellite imagery, did begin immediately after August 2019, particularly the one dealing with airfields and airstrips.
Right. One final question, Mr. Singh. Former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, on more than one occasion, said that the buck stops with me when it came to sort of varied situations. I want to ask you specifically, how does Mr. Modi acquit himself in how he has dealt with China? You have detailed a number of sort of things that the Modi administration failed to do. In fact, in failure not only to bridge the gap with China economically, but things became worse, as you said, with demonetization. But given the geopolitical reality, as you yourself laid out, the fact that none of these Quad members are going to be coming and fighting with you were things to get worse at the LAC. Very simply put, can you distill the information for our viewers and how you analyze Mr. Modi's and his administration's response to what has happened along the LAC and the overall China policy?
Because the question is in two parts, the government's policy on the line of actual control has not been honest. I think that's the number one point. It has not kept the public in confidence. It has not informed the public at all as to what has gone on. To give you an example, during the 1962 war, there was a parliamentary debate going on while the war was going on, where the Prime Minister was answering in Parliament what is going on. And the debate was initiated because Atal Bihari Vajpayee, one of the first time Rajya Sabha MP, actually went and requested Nehru. So that is the kind of accountability which is needed. Out here, no questions are allowed in Parliament. There's been no discussion in the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Defense. There's been no discussion at all, no press conference, no official briefing, no journalists have been taken. You remember the Kargil war. All journalists were taken to Kargil to see what Pakistan was doing. Why are journalists not being taken to Ladakh to see what the situation is? There has been almost a kind of, suppress the news, blackout of news, which clearly only strengthens China's hand, because China then realizes that this is a political weakness for India's leadership. It cannot afford to tell people what it has done. And if you cannot afford to say loudly what you have done, how can you negotiate strongly with China? One statement by Mr. Modi that no Chinese soldier is on our territory or has entered our territory clearly strengthened Chinese hands during negotiations. To say that your Prime Minister is saying this, how can a co-commander or a joint secretary from foreign ministry negotiate with the Chinese when your Prime Minister is giving a public statement on television saying that no Chinese soldier has come to our territory? Imagine the kind of weakness of the weak hand that India has to then play on in negotiations, the generals and the diplomats. So that is the fundamental point, that this whole policy of silence, of suppressing the news, has created a situation where India's hand has been weakened in these negotiations, particularly about on the LAC. The second point about the larger issue of Mr. Modi's China policy, and I'll just take you back a bit. If you remember, after the 2002 Gujarat riots, what happened is that Mr. Modi was not given a visa to travel to foreign countries, including to the United States and many Western countries in Europe, many European countries, including the United Kingdom. He would often travel to China at that point in time. And if you remember his statements at that point in time, China always welcomed him. And he spoke about making Ahmedabad and other countries like Shanghai or what have you. There are a lot of statements around that time. Even after he became Prime Minister, he met the Chinese President Xi Jinping 18 times before the pandemic struck, and in various bilateral formats and various multilateral formats, including two very famous informal summits, the term which was devised, one at Wuhan and one in Chennai. Despite all that, despite this personal conversation, despite his bonhomie with China, understanding of China, dealings with China, what has gone over the last 26 months clearly shows that his understanding of China, his understanding of Xi Jinping, his ability to deal with what has been thrown up by the Chinese leadership has been found wanting, to use a better phrase. And, he has not been able to deal with the Chinese threat the way many people expected him because of his past linkages with China, because of his understanding with Xi Jinping to be able to handle it. And I think that's something which should bother us. Because if someone who's met Xi Jinping 18 times, who has regularly traveled to China when the West was not allowing him to travel, is unable to understand what has gone on, and especially because a lot of emphasis by this government is on the personalized foreign policy of Mr. Modi and Mr. Modi's personal connect with foreign leaders, this strikes out even more. And I think that's something I would say about the China policy, Mr. Modi's China policy, which stands out. The bigger worry is what happens in the future. So, can India restore the status quo ante, or in some sense take back control of the areas it has lost control of? That's something to be seen. Then the other big worry is with the kind of infrastructure that the Chinese are building all over, not only in Ladakh, but also in Arunachal Pradesh, also in Sikkim, and the way they are, pushing their villagers across, the way they are making those the plans for those highways, etc. What happens in the next few coming years, and how does India, with its increasing gap with China, deal with this threat, deal with this situation? That's something which should worry Indians, and I think that's something Indians and Indian commentators and Indian writers should pay greater attention to. That's the most significant challenge India will face externally in the coming years.
All right. On that note, Sushant Singh, thank you as always for aiding our understanding of this issue and for speaking to us here at Scroll. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Smita. Always a pleasure speaking to you.